Hello, everybody. Welcome to the next African Composers interview. We have a guest composer with us today. He's speaking to us from South Africa. I will invite him to introduce himself shortly. Before I do, I would like to thank anybody who is going to join us live and anyone who will watch this interview later as a recorded interview. Thank you very much for your interest. Yes, we did move the interview by 10 minutes, but the issue was resolved rather early. Okay, so we've decided to start 8 minutes early. So we just moved the interview, but it's fine. Everything is working well. I can see people are already joining us. So it appears that some of you were already waiting. Thank you very much for your interest. And feel free to drop your questions and comments in the comments box. And if, depending on what they are, I can put them to the guest composer of today. So to our guest composer, thank you very much for joining us today. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. And yourself?
I'm fine. Thank you very much. Uh, Fantastic. So please, let's go on. Introduce yourself.
Well, I'm Matthijs Van Dijk. I was born in Cape Town, South Africa. I grew up in a musical family. My father is a composer, Peter Louis Van Dijk, and my mom was a singer and a singing teacher, Susie Van Dijk. And yeah, I think I remember at one point my grandmother explaining to me something like that I'm sort of fifth generation musician in the family. So there was no escape really for me. And I started learning the violin when I was 7. And around that time, I think I was about 8 or 9, I decided that I wanted to compose. Because I think also sort of growing up with my dad as a composer, it felt like a very normal thing to do. It's just everybody's parent composes. So I remember a lot of the time, sort of around that time, trying to write an opera, which I had decided to do, and my parents would be rehearsing for various projects, and I would be sitting at the back of the hall with these 3 notation books that I had carrying around with me. And of course, because I played violin, a lot of it was for violin. And then when I was a teenager, I started playing in a
Sorry,
rock band.
sorry for interrupting you. You tried to write an opera at what age?
I was 9 at the time. The piece is called The Magical Forest, and it had to do with a little boy. Can't remember the whole story, but a little boy who somehow had to go rescue a princess who had been turned into a cat or something like that. And and I actually quite recently, or a couple of years ago, I found these scores again and decided that because one has the technology now, I started inputting it all into Sibelius just to sort of listen back and hear, like, well, what was I doing?
Yes.
To the point where there is a work that I wrote a couple of years back where there was one little tune from that opera which I thought, this is nice. Like I'll develop it, and so I stole from myself, 20 something years later.
Okay. Well done.
But so yeah, so when I was a teenager, I started playing in a band and called Pepper, and we released 2 albums at the time, and I would do arrangements for it. So the rest of the disc, you'd have sort of punk music, very 90s punk. And in between these songs, you'd have one of mine, which would sort of be with an acoustic guitar and a clarinet and a cello, just because I felt like that's the sound world. Also, because there's a friend of mine who played cello and the guitarist played clarinet, so it was always kind of trying to meld these 2 worlds together. Um, yeah, so then when I was kind of in high school more, I decided that it was time to actually write it out, because at the time I'd usually sort of just write out, the lyrics and the chords above it, and kind of teaching myself to play guitar at the same time. Although my dad helped a lot with, there was a book that, I have to say that my dad helped a lot with learning composition anyway. Around that time and younger, I would always be able to bring him stuff that I was writing, and we'd sort of talk through, what I had done. But around that time, he got me a book of Beatles songs, which would have at the back of the book, it would have the chords. So I would sit in my room and sing and sort of get to a part of the song that I knew, and it's like, okay, I don't know this chord, go to the back and find it. At that point, a lot of the songs that I had written would be just sort of, I'd have like squiggle, squiggle, and I would remember what that squiggle meant, but later on find out it's like, oh, it's D minor. But so yeah, when I was in high school, I started notating stuff properly, I suppose. And at around that time, with the encouragement of obviously my family and my brother, who's a viola player, Matthijs Van Dijk, who plays in the Signum Quartet, who's based in Germany, they would encourage me to write, but they were, I remember as a teenager, Juan Munoz, who's a violinist from the Odeon String Quartet, and Marina Lowe from the Berkeley Music School, really encouraged me to write, and sort of would commission works for the Odeon Quartet as an example, and the Berkeley String Orchestra. There was like a work that I did called Memories and Final Wishes, which was for string orchestra and string quartet. And yeah, from there I ended up studying at UCT. At the time, there wasn't an official composition degree. They had decided that it was, if you wanted to do composition, you had to study a general. So I ended up doing my general degree at General B. Muzz at UCT with Peter Klatzo, and having lessons on the side with Hendrik Hofmeyer, as well as still kind of bringing my stuff to my dad throughout that time. I also remember I had a masterclass with Kevin Bolins at the time, and just anyone who I could talk to. And yeah, in 2006, I won the Samro composition bursary. And instead of, I know sort of a lot of the people at the time would use it to go and study at a university and carry on their studies like that. I was not such a big fan of academia, and I decided rather to use that money to get master classes with whoever I could talk to, and instead of sort of being stuck at one institution, to kind of go around and whoever I could meet. So I spent a couple of months living in New York, where I got to see concerts. I got to explore the scene. I met and had very, very influential chats with people like Missy Mazzoli or Samuel Adler, Richard Daniel Poor. At one point I had a very good lesson with. Christoph Meyer when I was in Germany. I don't know if he's still there, but he was connected to the Cologne University. And yeah, so through that, then while being in Germany and Holland as well, I had 2 weeks with a guy there called Samuel Friesen, who was lovely, lovely gentleman. And we would basically, the lessons would be, I would come and we would sit down and he would let me raid his CD collection. And sort of we'd talk about various ideas. And the thing that sort of stuck with me the most when I was in New York was the tradition that they have of, which has become a much more global thing, but at the time, the thing of playing classical music in bars and sort of slightly like less traditional concert venue kind of ideas. And that was something that when I came back to South Africa, is something that I was a very strong kind of like, this is what I want to do. This makes sense to me. And then a few years later, with Cara Stacey, who you spoke with this morning, and Sarah Evans and Galina Juritz and Nicola DeToy, we formed a group called, at the time it was called the Shot Ensemble, but then it became the Nightlight Collective. And sort of did that thing of playing in bars, playing in, there was a concert that we did in a vintage car garage in the middle of Salt River, with where it was like a string quartet with Cara playing bow and a drummer, and then like a motorcycle orchestra, and 6 bikers coming in and revving up, and it was absolute chaos, but a lot of fun. And yeah, I mean, other projects that I've sort of been involved in since I've been back, the South African Film Orchestra, which I co-founded with Simon Ratcliffe and the Sound and Motion Studios. And the idea basically, because a lot of the time people will come to South Africa to film, but not do a lot of post-production. So we were trying to offer an alternative to sort of, that they didn't have to go back to the States or to Hungary or wherever, the slightly cheaper orchestras are, or, that they could do it locally. And that was sort of, I had met Simon years before with another group called the Macabre Ensemble, where we would, for the last 10 or so years, we've been playing live soundtracks to old sort of classic horror movie silent films. So through that, Fuzzy and I, or Simon, got to sort of know the love of film and sort of bring those two worlds together. And yeah, I mean, other than that, I've been doing a lot of arranging for concerts such as Starlight Classics and bigger, orchestral arrangements primarily. What else? And then the other thing that I started quite recently was which has currently been on a break for a while, is the South African Composers Archive, which is a podcast series that I did for a while. And there is an episode that I want to release quite soon, which I did recently with Kevin Volans. It does involve, however, editing a 3-hour interview. So it's that kind of trying to find the time to put it together. And I know there are a couple of people who do follow that series, so it is coming. There are more coming, I promise, eventually. But yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction and taking us on a journey from when you started up to where you are today. Well done on all your different projects. Let's talk about your background a bit. It's clear that you come from a musical family, as you said. Was that instrumental with making it easy for you to get involved in music? Some people have told stories about detractors trying to discourage them. It seemed that for you, it was encouraged. Getting into music was encouraged.
I mean, my parents I remember having this conversation once with them when I was about 16, 17, where I had really had enough of music. And at the time, I wanted to be a basketball coach. I spent a lot of time playing basketball as a teenager, and I had no interest in music except for the band. But the conversation I remember having at the time was basically along the lines of like, can you at least do music until you matriculate, until you're finished with school, and then you can obviously do whatever you want to do. But to be honest, I mean, at the time, it was very much sort of, I mean, it's not as if my parents were like, you must do music. They did say like, well, look, do you really hate it this much that you don't want to do it anymore? And I had a long think about it, and I was like, actually, you know what? This is I I mean, talking to a friend of mine about this. I don't really know what else to do. I must be honest. Like, if I weren't going to do music, I probably would have done something like drama or art. I would have been stuck very much in the arts somewhere. But I think that thing of growing up in that environment of seeing rehearsals, seeing concerts. I mean, one of my earliest memories is watching my parents with my brother do a production of Amal and the Night Visitors, and sort of sitting at the back of the hall, crying my eyes out every time Amal would leave his mom, because it was my brother and my mom sort of playing those characters, and it just felt a little bit too real. But yeah, I think it was never sort of like, I was never forced to do it. I think it just sort of by constantly being around it, by constantly, and I think I was on a certain level lucky to have gotten heard certain ideas and certain pieces and stuff long before I reached university. So it was that kind of, it was just always around me, I guess. I don't know if that answers your question, or if I've now brought up others, but yeah.
Yes, it does. It does. And it's clear that you're somebody who is inclined towards creativity and the creative space it's really interesting that at the age of, what was it, 8 or 9, you had already started to work on an opera. I mean, that's quite something for
I
somebody at that age.
I was determined to have it, to get it performed at the time. I think a lot of, I mean, again, that whole sort of like having to create, having to do stuff. I mean, I know at the time they were singing students of my mom. One of the things, one of my first big love was cartooning, and I would draw cartoons, and I would draw based on my cats and stuff like that. And they would always encourage me. It's like, no, you should do this opera, but it should be an animation. You should try and create this cartoon of it. And I guess, I mean, nowadays with stuff like YouTube and things like that, like that's easy. Everyone can do it, kind of thing. But at the time, it was just like, no, I'm writing, and this is separate from the cartoons, and to keep it like that.
Okay. Well, you started creating from a very young age. Can you tell us about your music composition process?
At the time, or how I work now. I generally, I need a deadline a lot of the time. I need to have some kind of I need to have some kind of deadline. I tend to jump straight into it. Um, but I will try and think a lot of the times about what I'm going to do. I don't sketch rare. I very rarely write out any sketches or anything like that. I think stuff like the creation of the notation software that we have has been a huge help in how I work, in order to hear back what I'm doing. I think a lot of the time, like when I was writing as a teenager and younger, it would sort of be at the piano, and then the stuff that I would write would be very much stuck to my ability as a pianist. So being able to just sort of throw it into Sibelius straight away, hear it back, I kind of can then start cutting and trimming and letting the piece kind of guide me where it wants to go. Like I usually do kind of try to have at least a bit of an idea of how I want to end the piece. But even there, I've had stuff sort of come in the middle where it's just like, oh no, wait, this is much better. This is like, forget that kind of thing. It's a lot. It's not trial and error, but I tend to find like maybe 2 or 3 strong ideas, and then just sort of sit with those 2 or 3 ideas and see where it takes me.
Okay. Talking about ideas, I've looked at some of your compositions. Some of them have quite memorable names. Let me read out some of the names. One of them is titled The Vanquishing of Mr. Gallows with a Trout.
Yes.
The other, we have Othello's Wild Years, Personal Graffiti, Truce, he asked. So,
Yeah.
which one comes first, the title or the actual composition, and which one drives the other?
Depends on the piece. I could say with the ones that the ones that you mentioned, at any rate, the Mr. Gallows and the Trout is a part of a quartet that I had written. It's the last movement, a piece called Music for an Unwritten Play. And it was just this sort of like story that I had in my head of it was sort of like a parody of sort of 1920s melodrama, silent film, Mr. Gallows with the long twirly moustache and the top hat, and the whole kind of tying the woman to the train track and running off, sort of old-fashioned kind of film. And the Trout elements, I don't know, that is just sort of like a joke that I'd have with my brother, and that sort of idea of like attacking someone with a fish. It's a very sort of Monty Python goon show humor kind of idea. So that was kind of like comes from the story of the piece that I was doing. But then you look at something like Personal Graffiti, which is based on the middle movement of that piece is a song that I wrote when I was at Varsity, a group called Dawn Treader. And I liked the idea of that song. I mean, the whole story of that piece is kind of ties into what I was saying about Missy Mazzoli and Christoph Meyer. Of she really encouraged me to sort of bring out the rock music element of the stuff that I was writing. Because, and in her words, it'd sort of always be like, I'd say that I would write rock music, but it was never really evident. And it's kind of like you'd have to sort of dig for it a little bit and go like, is it the use of the fifths? I guess maybe, so it was with her encouragement to sort of really lean hard into that. And so that is sort of pointing back to that piece. Trucy Asked, on the other hand, was very much a case of I had written the piece and I needed a title. And I dug through. It was written for the Samra bursary,
Okay.
specifically for the portfolio, and I just Googled South African poems, and that was the first line of a poem called "Forgive and Forget" that I really liked. What was quite funny is the poets actually found me and emailed me out of the blue once and said like, I see you've used this, and having to kind of go like, yes, I did. It got absolutely nothing to do with your poem, but thank you for the title. But yeah.
Wow, that's really interesting. Does it mean that it will be difficult for somebody like you to get a commission with a title and a description of what the commissioner wants, so to speak, or the commissioning body?
No, I don't think so. I think it depends from piece to piece. I think like the only time I really I guess struggle is if it's a work that needs a text, and that's usually kind of has to do with like copyright reasons and trying to find a poem that really kind of like speaks to me. And like I have written quite a few song cycles and stuff based on poems that I like, but it kind of gets to a point where it's just like, well, these are all the poems that I really like, and I suppose I could dig for more, and then it just becomes too much effort. So I mean, like there was a commission that I did. I mean, on that level, I'm very lazy. I mean, I'm doing this interview from bed, so it says a lot. But it is that sort of thing of I I will like there was a commission that I was asked to do not too long ago called "Can We Talk About," and it's the text for that. I didn't feel like hunting for a lyric, and I ended up just using two phrases that I constantly had stuck in my head at the time. And the one was "ladies and gentlemen," and that came from the various concerts that I was doing at the time and having talking to the audience. And the other was "Can We Talk About," which came from doing those podcasts. And it was just like, especially as around that time the format of the podcast is I ask every composer the same 12, I think, questions. And, to do that week after week after week after week, you start having sort of the same ideas and the same thoughts constantly being repeated. So the solution then was just like, well, I'm just going to write the whole piece on "Ladies and Gentlemen, Can We Talk About?" And then it's just like, cool, that solved that problem, and now I can deal with the music side of things.
Okay, all right. So, well, if you are seeking people to collaborate with on words, text for your music, feel free to reach out to the African composers through the African Composers Facebook page. I'm sure you will find a lot of librettists willing to collaborate there. But brilliant.
Totally. Yeah.
What you do. What is your goal? This is quite a wide question, but as a composer, never mind that you get commissioned or you just sit down and you write music, freestyle, improvise. What is your goal as a composer?
Wow. World domination. No. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I think like a lot of the stuff that I do, I think if I can look at it like that, there is, I think, unfortunately, a little bit of a stigma with classical music or art music, where it is, I don't know, it feels always a little bit sort of like high art, very high art. But if you look at sort of like the composers, their history and their background and stuff, I still like, I think, Beethoven and Mozart and the whole, of that history, they were the rock stars of their day. And it somehow along the line, it sort of, I remember reading somewhere about this, I think it was talking about musicals, about how, someone like Puccini was like the everyday person art. And then somehow over the years, it's become this sort of like, this is now the elite art, and we don't listen to that. And I think with like everything that I do, from like, the playing in bars and that kind of approach, it's not to bring it to the ground a little bit, because I think obviously every composer is a human being, and we are, we're all people at the end of the day. But it is to slightly kind of remove it from that. And I don't want to say make it more accessible, because I think like that sort of gives that impression of like, oh, the music must be tonal. And that's not true at all. I mean, if I think of, the bar concerts that I saw in New York, you'd have some pretty far out stuff happening, but you were also in an environment where you could go, no, I don't like this, I'm going to go have a cigarette, and then, leave. And it just sort of like immediately, I think, makes it a little bit more, I don't say palatable, because again, that makes it sound like the music is difficult to listen.
I understand with you.
It's, yeah, I think if especially, I mean, like I look at the group, the Nightlight Collective. I mean, for a long time, we were called the Shot Ensemble. And there's obviously a certain connotation with that. And, you'd have people kind of like, you know that sounds an awful lot like, it's like, yes, we know it's a poo joke. It is a poo joke. We get it. But it's that kind of like thing of like, it's still, that doesn't change from the music that we're doing and what we're creating. Obviously, then we changed it to the Nightlight Collective, and the idea there as well, it's a similar thing of just trying to bring a little bit of light, I suppose, in the world, for one of a better phrase. Makes me sound more important than I am, but you know what I mean. It's that just kind of, yeah, trying to shift perception, I guess, of classical music.
That's it. Yeah. I absolutely understand what you're saying. Let's quickly go back to you, the early stages. Do you remember the name of your first composition? Or was it the opera?
It would have been the opera, yeah, The Magical Forest. I think, okay. I mean, from there were other works. I remember there was sort of like a short series of piano pieces based on the cartoon cat that I was drawing. And it was sort of, very just my ability of piano, sort of like, cat falls downstairs, plonk, 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 and then next piece kind of thing. But I think like if I were to say sort of like my first kind of like proper composition, or the first time I'm like, I'm doing this now, it probably would be my first string quartet, I think, which was when I was in high school. And that's sort of where I sort of start from. That was the work that Juan Munoz commissioned, which was a thing called Hotel 35, which was based on a poem that I'd written, so quartet with narrator. Yeah.
Okay, well, you've since been commissioned to compose for a number of chamber ensembles and orchestras, including, in fact, the Carnegie Hall affiliated Dakota Ensemble.
Yes.
Which one is your most memorable? Which one actually, first of all, which one came as a surprise? Which one made you say, oh my goodness, I've made it, or I did not expect to ever get this commission?
That I would have to say is the Moments in a Life piece that I did with the Rivonia trialist Dennis Goldberg. That if there were a piece that I can say this one, changed my life, it would be that. I think the Dakota piece came from that experience, and most of the commissions and stuff that I've gotten have come from that point, where I was fortunate enough to have been asked by the Stellenbosch Chamber Music Festival to write a piece with him about his life story and his experiences in prison, and everything that he went through. That I think is like, while up until that point, there definitely were bigger commissions and stuff that I had done, and there were some works that had been done overseas and stuff like that. But that was sort of the first time I remember actively, like, while writing it, thinking, like, people are actually going to be listening to this. Like, I need to really kind of pay attention to what I'm doing. And then I sort of remember having arguments with my brother at the time. Like, he conducted it, but it was sort of that thing of like him questioning, why did I do certain choices in the piece, and kind of going like, you don't understand, like, I have spent so much time thinking about this. Like, this is not just, like, oh, I'm just doing it because,
Okay, and was that difficult for you working with the trialist? Was it emotionally tasking? What happened? What was the experience?
It was not an easy time. I think like the work with him itself was straightforward. We met a couple of times, and I so the first time I met him, he gave me his biography, and I went and read it. And
For those who don't know, can
sorry,
you just give me a few lines about who he is, what happened
who
for anybody?
Dennis? So Dennis Goldberg is he was one of the founding members of Mkhonto Sizwe. He's often kind of referred to as like the one white guy in the struggle. He was friends with Mandela, and he when everyone was sent off to Robben Island because he was white, he was sent to Pretoria prison. And there's actually a movie that's come out quite recently with Daniel Radcliffe, based on his time in the prison and how they managed to escape at one point. I don't want to spoil anything for the movie for people who want to see it, but anyway, the point is, I know like at the time we actually spoke about wanting to include that story, and he was like, he didn't want to have it included. So I did have to smile when I saw that they've now made an entire movie about it. But yeah, so he was a member of the ANC, and yeah, one of the I should know how many they were. I want to say 12. We've only tried 11. It's been a while since I've
12, but I might be wrong as well. I know I watched
12, it is 12. Yeah.
And I remember being 12, but I might be wrong as well.
No, I think it is 12. But so the putting it together, so I interviewed him, and we ended up sort of discussing kind of like, okay, well, these are the stories that we want to include. And I sat down with him and recorded him talking for basically an hour. And then with that conversation, had to sort of condense it down to what became, I think, about a 35-minute piece. And the process of it, I mean, like at the time, I had shingles twice while working on it. It was just the stress of what was going on around it, and also having to deal with the contents of it. Like I will never forget that. So one of the movements deals with his time where he's in the Pretoria prison, and they were based next to. I can actually feel myself getting emotional talking about this, but he was based next to the gallows, and how every week someone would, or like a group of people would get hung there, and sort of the night before you would have all the other political prisoners and everyone there singing comfort to the guy who's meant to be hung the next morning. And yeah, I can't even talk about it now, but at the time, having to edit the text and having to listen to him talk it again and again and again and tell that story. While this was happening, there was a very fun concert that the Nightlight Collective was doing together with Kara, and the way like our ensemble would rehearse, it's usually very fun and like glasses of wine, and like we do it because we enjoy hanging out together. But that whole process, everyone else is drinking wine, and I'm sort of walking around slightly with shingles, drinking fennel tea. Just because it was just too much to constantly have sitting in my head for that many months. I know, and again, it's not to make it sound more important than it is, but I would talk about method composing, as in that sort of thing of like really putting myself into it and trying as best as I can to experience what he's talking about, to understand exactly what he was going through, to the point where around that whole time, I mean, I know it doesn't look it, but I do sometimes shave, but at the time, it was just letting myself go to a certain extent, that when I had finally finished the project, I remember very clearly kind of going like, right, it's time to shave. And it's just sort of like, I'm done. I can now carry on to the next thing. But it was, I mean, he passed away quite recently. as sort of the beginning of the lockdown happened. And it is that sort of surreal thing of that. I mean, I met him probably, like, I want to say 10 to 12 times. But while I can't say that I know him particularly well or knew him particularly well, on the other hand, I do kind of feel that I spent a lot of time inside his head. And it really affected me quite strongly, especially with what's going on at the moment as well. I remember talking to my brother about it at the time, where it's just that sort of like how insane it is to have spent, I think it was 26 years in prison, and now kind of like near the end of his life being told like, okay, everybody, you got to go home and you're not allowed to go outside and you're not allowed to, that's it. And just that sort of strange thing of like how much life one has missed, and all the stories of, I think if I remember correctly, during his entire time in prison, he was only allowed to speak with his daughter once a year, and she was the only person that he was allowed to see. And it just sort of, I don't know, he was an incredible human being, and just it was amazing, and I was very fortunate to be able to spend a little bit of time with him and get to know him. I mean, it's that thing of like, on the one hand, you add a lot of sort of like, it was not an easy life by any means, and there's a lot of heaviness to it. But I think of, the writing process as well. The first session that I had with him, and this wouldn't be a Matthijs story if it didn't somehow involve this, but I had, unfortunately, an insane hemorrhoid, and I had to sort of sit with him and have like a 2-hour interview with him, and I had to say to him, like, I'm so sorry, sir, like, if it looks like I'm in a lot of pain, I am, and this is why. And he goes, hemorrhoids, a real pain in the butt. And it's just sort of like, to have that kind of like from this man, this sort of real kind of like human experience. No, it was really a very, very special time. And for me.
All right, well done for working on that project, working with him.
Thank you.
In his voice for the ages as well, because that is something I talk about with as many African composers as I can, the importance of recording our history. So well done. And you are doing that, in fact, as part of your podcast, which is something you talked about earlier, the South African Composers Archive. So I think you're also trying to record history in that way as well, directly from the composers themselves.
I remember at the time there was an interview that I did for the Moments in a Life piece, and someone asked me why is it important to do these kind of works? Like, do I think it's important to do these kind of works? And I compared it to I remember when I was in Cologne and in Berlin, they have these things called Stolpersteine, which are basically sort of outside it translates to a stumble stone, I suppose, or tripping over a stone. And it's outside the houses where Jewish people would live, and people who had been carted off to the concentration camps. They would place these little plaques in the middle of the road as like a memorial of the people who lived there. And it's that sort of thing of like, when I was in Cologne, I remember sitting and it was like a beautiful kind of spring evening. You're sitting outside and you're having a drink and having a lovely time. And you sort of look down, and underneath your chair, there's the Stolperstein. Just sort of saying that like the house that is now a bar, there were people here, and like these are all the names of everyone who got taken to the camps. And I think that we need pieces like that. We need pieces like, I mean, there's that age-old thing of like, friends of mine will kind of, make fun. It's like, can't we all just get over it? It happened 20 years ago. Like, can't we move on? And it's just like, no, you can't. Like, you need that, because that's how you forget. That's how this stuff happens again and again. So I on that level, I mean, it's not to say like this piece is important, but one does kind of need works like that in art to kind of just have sort of like a, hey, just, that drink that you're enjoying and you're having a lovely time, not to obviously always feel bad about everything, but like you have to have moments of like just remembering how you got to where you got. Because otherwise, yeah, I mean, you can see what's going on globally at the moment. It's like, people forget their history. People forget, like, how, and it's just repeating. And yeah, anyway.
Okay. And has it been interesting? Have you discovered or spoken to, I suppose, interviewed any composers that you were not aware of as part of your podcast?
Not yet, unfortunately. The people that I've spoken to are people that I've been aware of, but I have a list on my phone that is constantly growing. And it's also kind of like that thing of why it's also taken me a little bit of time to do more, is because when I started it, it was kind of like, cool, so there are like 180 people that I want to speak to. And sort of by the time I finished that sentence, a friend of mine will go, oh, by the way, do you know of these other 5? It's like, okay, let me just add that to the list. And it just keeps growing. There's a guy who befriended me on Facebook not too long ago, who, when I announced that I was going to do this podcast, somehow it ended up in the paper, and this guy contacted me and he's like, look, I live in this tiny town in the middle of nowhere. Do I qualify for this? And the approach that I had with the podcast was that anyone who creates, as far as I'm concerned, it's like, it's not for me to kind of stand around and go, this is an important composer. This is an important composer. Because if you look at sort of history, how many, at the time, really important big composers, and no one plays their stuff these days. No one knows. And it's that sort of thing of like, just to present as, this is why I ask everyone the same questions. It's to sort of keep it as level as possible of like, obviously people have different experiences and some have done more than others. But one doesn't know how history is going to treat one composer, or how it goes from there. So there definitely are people that are on the list that it will come one day. I will speak to him, because also to be honest, there is an interesting thing of like, well, what exactly, how is the music of someone who is completely removed from sort of like the traditional school of how to learn composition, and like what kind of stuff are they creating? Like, it could be really interesting. So yeah, no, it's I will get to them, but there definitely are composers whose work I don't know at all.
Okay, that's really interesting. I found a quote from you from 2017, and you
Okay.
started podcasts in 2019. But I think it is clear from looking at this post on Facebook that there was something already in your mind, perhaps years before 2019. Let me just read the whole quote and for our audience,
Okay.
and then we'll talk about what you just addressed. So you said you titled, or you started by saying, observation for the day. At the risk of not being invited to certain Christmas parties, there's a list that has been doing the rounds compiling South African composers. And what has been so fantastic and encouraging to see is just how many varied, forward thinking, and highly creative voices this country has produced. All who are trying to push the scene forward, shift boundaries, and bring new art music into the 21st century, compared to the less than a handful but admittedly vocal group of composers angrily dictating how they think that music should be and who actually counts as a composer. I think it's sort of what you've just addressed. In fact, the job
Yep.
or function of the less than handful that people sometimes refer to as gatekeepers. And you are in that position now. And I think I sort of sit in that position as well. Who decides who is a composer, who to let through and who not to let through? I
Yeah.
think you probably had this in mind for longer than.
100%. I think it's also, I mean, I sort of touched on it a little bit earlier, sort of my thoughts about academia. And I say this carefully and with love to friends who are in academia, but there can be an element of gatekeeping. And there can be sort of an element of like, okay, well, why? Why have we decided that this composer is important? one of the questions that I asked before and I sort of already kind of knew that I was going to do the podcast at this point, but I remember posting on Facebook something along the lines of like, is there any way to see who are the composers that get taught at universities? And like, why is this composer being taught and not this composer? And it was kind of interesting to see, as an example, like I couldn't get as much information as that I wanted, and people kind of got a little bit quiet around it, and some people offered to help and then went completely quiet. But it's that thing of like, you'll have within the same couple of kilometers, you'll have Cape Town University and Stellenbosch University as an example. But why are there different names on the one list than on the other? And it's like they're not that far apart from each other. Surely, like, stuff is happening there that there's a little bit of overlap. So it was something. This is kind of like what helped the podcast sort of come to be. Is that thing of like, well, yes, there definitely are important composers that have been mentioned. There are quite a few that sort of fall through the cracks. Like like another Genesis, probably a little bit before that post, around the time of Fees Must Fall. I was talking to friends of mine who are involved in it, and even though I wasn't a student, I can't even remember how I got invited to it, but there was sort of like a small group of members of the Fees Must Fall movement, and they were talking about the sort of the syllabus, for want of a better word, at UCT. And one of the students there said something along the lines of like, there are no composers of color, very few composers, women composers. And at the time, I think there was sort of like only one composer under the age of 40 who was being discussed. And it's not to take away from the other composers that are being discussed, but it is that sort of thing of like, okay, but why? Why has this been decided that these are the composers that we're going to talk about? So yeah, I mean, I remember at the time when I posted that, I think the continuation of the quote, if I remember correctly, is that it doesn't take a lot of people to open the window to let the old farts vanish. And it's not kind of like like I hereby declare war on everyone, but it is just that thing of like, there are some vocal voices who are in charge of this, which is, again, as I'm sure with what you do, it's that sort of thing of like trying to decide, well, who is important to talk to, who is important not to talk to. And it's kind of a little bit my cross to bear, as it were. Just decided, I'm just going to speak to everyone. Anyone who will, like, if I can put a microphone in front of them and they are willing to talk with me, then I will interview them. Yeah, I mean, obviously, like, I don't know, there comes a point where you kind of have to go like, well done, you've written one piece on a napkin at a restaurant. I think maybe I'll look at someone else's work. But even there, it's, there are some composers that I've spoken to already who I think are kind of very much at the beginning of their career. And I would love to, at some point when I've done a little bit more, revisit and go back and sort of see like, okay, well, what has happened in this time? Did you grow to where I thought you could potentially, or did you, become a banker or something and decide like, I'm done with music? That is also definitely something that can happen.
Yes. That's a very important conversation to also have. It's not necessarily that they should be established, well-known composers. That's a decision I've also taken. And you can see sometimes there is some feedback on the African Composers Facebook page about whose work is being posted, or the quality of the presentation. But yes, I have decided everything goes. I've never had to have a difficult decision about what to share and what not to, until I would say very recently. In fact, as recently as yesterday, for the first time ever, I received something and I thought, I don't think I'm going to share that. But I think it ties in, maybe not directly, but slightly with what you are talking about with respect to who is that voice, who says this is who to respect and who to celebrate. This one is rather different. This one comes from is something that I've observed sitting in the West, where there are certain descriptions and terms that are used to describe certain people. They are well known, everybody just uses them. But for me as an African, I find them unacceptable. So when somebody says, share this on your page, and I see that expression, I think, well,
Yeah.
I will never call myself that. You want me to put this in front of Africans to basically tell
Yes.
Africans, get used to this name because it's what we call you in the West. I'm sorry, I'm
Yeah.
not going to conduit. So I said I'd think about it, but it's really
It's
difficult.
it is very, very difficult. I think like there have been interviews that I know that I have to do or will, well, not have to do, but I will do at some point. But I remember that I was talking to someone about a composer, and she said to me something along the lines of, but will you bring up, what this composer does? And at the time, it was about cultural appropriation. And it was sort of that thing of like, well, I don't like, as an African woman, I don't like what he does. Will you bring this up in the conversation? And it's that sort of thing of like, yeah, this is difficult because it's like, you want to obviously try and as equally as possible give everyone their voice and everything, but at the same time, like my own thoughts and feelings about it are going to work its way into it. I think like if I look at like the first couple of composers that I interviewed as an example,
Yeah.
the majority are composers who I'm like, I really like this stuff. I'm in for it. But like I'm not gonna sort of I obviously want to present it to everyone because like I know people like different music to what I like.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
it's that thing of the as you say, it's that sort of trying to bring in how someone approaches something, but you don't necessarily want to sit there. It's like, here on this day you said, like, and can you, like, I have 30 people who really hate you and they want me to tell you how much they hate, it's like, thanks for your time, by the way. It's just sort of,
Yeah.
it gets a little bit difficult.
It is.
But
It is.
I know what you mean. It is that sort of like trying to navigate that line of, and I think also, I mean, I know there was an interview that I did at the time, one of the earlier episodes where I gave a talk at Africa Open at the Stellenbosch University about the podcast. And what someone mentioned to me at the time was that because I am not connected to university, it's a lot easier for me to kind of like stand up and kind of go like, okay, so like, let's have a look at what's really going on. And I know it'll probably, like, as I say this, I can hear whoever's reading this going like, well, quit, like I'm done. But it is like I'm in a fortunate position, I guess, on that level to sort of not to be neutral because obviously I do have thoughts and feelings on stuff, but to try and like navigate
Yes.
that whole
Yes.
that world.
Yes, it would be useful, but you're absolutely right. And it's interesting to hear somebody who does something along similar lines and talk about his experience. It would be useful for some of us, I guess, people from different parts of the world, to be a little bit less lazy when it comes to the way we see the world outside of our own. So what I have observed is a kind of laziness that made me hesitate with yesterday's post. It just happened yesterday, so it's quite fresh in my mind.
I mean, there definitely have been interviews that I've done. If one goes back to it, where someone will say something, and I will kind of go, I don't know about that. Like, I'm not sure. But it's also kind of trying again not to kind of like say like you're a bad person.
Yeah,
Now please answer all these questions.
you don't want to engage.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really interesting. Somebody has asked a question, but before I put the question up, I'll just put this comment up very quickly. So they're asking for the links to the podcast.
You can either find it on it's on the podcast app or iTunes. It's available there, or iMusic. It's also up on SoundCloud if you prefer to listen to stuff like that. There, I think there are about 19 episodes up, and the next one is coming when eventually I have the will to do it again. But yeah.
That's good. And the same person, I believe, yes, Sonia, asked a question earlier, which I am actually going to put to you now. It's talking about what you've been doing, or one of the things you've worked on during the lockdown. You were involved in the creation of the score for a project called Metamorph. So it was presented as part of South Africa's National Arts Festival. Tell us
Yes.
about your experience working on this project during lockdown.
It wasn't. I did not expect to ever do something like this, but it was around the time just before the lockdown happened. I was asked to write a ballet for Darkened Contemporary, fantastic a modern dance ensemble that we have in Cape Town, and we were going to do a tour. It was of a new work that I'd written, and it was going to be with Bryden Bolton playing bass, and myself on violin. And unfortunately, because of lockdown, that had to, I don't know, I don't think it's been scrapped, but it's been put on hold for the time being. So around then, a couple of weeks ago, I spoke to Louise Couture from Darkroom, and she told me about this project and the idea behind it. I think it's still going for a couple of more days on the website. It's kind of like those choose your own adventure books, which I don't think exist anymore, but that sort of idea of like, you get to page 20 and it's like, you have a decision, open the door or, go eat a sandwich. And, if you want to open the door, go to page 20. If you eat a sandwich, turn to the next page. And with the girl, Inca, and Darkroom. So the girl is a VJ and will do sort of like a lot of the visual. Yes, end of July, so it should still be up for a while. A visual artist, and the idea is it's myself and three other composers, Shane Cooper, Bryden Bolton as well, and Sean O'Tim, also known as Mr. Sakatumi. And we each wrote little, they're each about 8 minutes long, where you as the viewer can then choose, it's sort of 4 sections, and you can choose the next step in the show. That if you want to follow, you get given options, and you can choose to see one choreography with the same music, or a different composer, and sort of work your way through that. For me, it was quite interesting in as much as that for a long time, and this is one of those, like, I should have maybe paid a little bit more attention in certain classes when I was at UCT, slightly more technological side of things. I'm very used to working with real life human beings in the world, not the world, in the room, sort of like a string quartet or an orchestra. So to suddenly kind of be put in a situation of like, okay, this now needs to be all digital, or I need to figure out how I'm going to record myself, and I don't really have the technology here. So I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, and somehow this came up where it was just like, why have I never thought of doing this, which is to use the MIDI of Sibelius and to then change the sounds with the sound library and sort of mess around with that. And so the section that I wrote is called Evolution. And I kind of I approached it from that as sort of like the first section is just sort of 2-3 notes, and then the next section is the same 3 notes but a little bit more intricate, and just sort of I started then kind of playing around with more of the thing of like, well, I have to think outside of this. Is not just having to write it for the abilities of the performer. I really can now do whatever I want, which was quite freeing. And I know it's one of those, like, I can hear, however many people going like, but we all do this. It's just like, yes, but I didn't. And it took me a moment to kind of figure out how to do that. So on that level, there are a couple of projects coming up where I now, for the time being at any rate, as much as I love using real instruments and love that kind of like, I've always tried to sort of create stuff that sounds electronic, but without using any electronics. So this is kind of new for me to sort of go like, okay, well, now I'm focusing 100% on the more electronic and slightly synthesized, but also at the same time trying to do it in a way that it still has that the sound that you get with a real instrument, kind of to that it doesn't sound robotic, I suppose, to try and make it sound as real as possible, tangible, I think.
Okay. You've talked about being creative. I think it really matters to you, perhaps not being stifled or caged in, without being disrespectful to those who have written the rules and who follow the rules. Is it necessary to allow or to even encourage people to express themselves creatively? Now, bearing in mind that there may be concerns that this will lead to either new creations, which are good, or just uncontrolled, unmanageable chaos. What do you?
If I understand correctly, if people should create, or that one should be encouraged to create, or
Yes, it's necessary to allow and to encourage this kind of creativity where there are no boundaries, people just can sidestep the rules. What is your viewpoint on that?
so one of the interesting things about doing the podcast was one of the questions that I would ask is sort of like, what is the best advice that you've ever received from a teacher? And the example that I always use is there is one composer was talking about how their teacher was telling them that you need change, you need you can't have stuff too consistent. Like something needs to happen so that your ear gets your ear gets bored easily, and you want to hear something new, and you latch onto that. Whereas then another composer that I was speaking to told me about, it's that philosophy of like, a meter of blue is the bluest of blue kind of thing. And it's that sort of like, you want to try and do as much as possible with as little material as possible. And the question that I then had while like doing this was like, well, which is right? Which is the correct answer? Because both are very acceptable and both make a lot of sense. So on that, I think this answers your question of that thing of like, just write, just create, put stuff out there, and it doesn't matter how you do it. Like, I understand that there are obviously certain kind of like inverted commas guidelines that you need to follow. If you are writing for like a horn or something like that, don't then come along with something that is in the range of a piccolo and then sit around going, no one understands my art. They're not playing. It's just like, well, there are certain limitations that, the person can't do that. But if you are writing within, even there, I mean, like, I think there's that story I remember hearing about when at Varsity, the thing of Saint-Saëns having written his orchestration book, and quite soon after it was published, sitting in a rehearsal for the Rite of Spring, and hearing that opening and sort of turning to someone going like, that's an interesting oboe sound, and someone going like, that's the bassoon, and they're like, what? And then like leaving. And it's that thing of like, yes, you kind of can push boundaries, obviously, and just have to think a little bit outside of the normal box, I guess. But I think on that level, it's just like, just create. And I think this is, one of the lovely things of working with people like the Nightlight Collective, like Cara and Sarah and Galena and Nicola, that we have these sort of mantras a little bit before and after a show. Like after the show, it's usually that kind of like, you're having the post-concert drink and you're sort of like, we made a thing. Like, yeah, we totally made a thing. And before, like, I can say from, there's an album that we did as a trio, which should hopefully come out someday. And at the time, I know that all three of us were going through some really dark times, and we were all grappling with our stuff. And we decided that we were going to do this album just to try and put some form of light again, just to put something into the world, something positive, something that can give someone a moment of calm or a moment of beauty or excite them or whatever. And it really, and I think this is also like why I like doing the podcast, is it is so exciting, like I said in that post, to just see all these voices, all these, like, the stuff that's out there, and it doesn't matter how it comes out. Somebody's gonna like it. Like, even if it's just, your mom or whatever, but like someone will like it. And if you're lucky, like, that some of us who are fortunate enough to do this as a career, when you discover that, like, hey, there are more than like maybe 5 people who like this, and then you just keep doing it. It's that thing of, I remember there was a student composer who was talking about all these plans and stuff that they wanted to do of an ensemble, and they wanted to create this new music ensemble, but you need the funding, and then like without the funding you can't do it. And it's just like, no, that's not the point. Like, if you're waiting for the funding, if you're waiting for people to be interested in your stuff, then it's never going to happen. The only time people can actually like get an idea of what you're doing is if you actually do it. And like, I mean, with again, like, I mean, the best, I think on many levels, the best thing that has ever happened for me creatively was the Nightlight Collective, where it really was just this thing of like, I had a string quartet, the personal graffiti work, and I wanted it performed. And they were, because I knew at the time while I was writing it, it's just like, this is good. And it's like, I mean, everyone's obviously self-critical of one's own stuff. So it's very rare when one's kind of like, this actually is good. I think this says something, and I would like to have it out there. And I was very fortunate to know Sarah, the viola player, and she kind of like pushed me into doing it, because I wouldn't have done it otherwise. But it's that idea of like, as soon as like the group was formed, and as soon as things started happening and we started doing more, and then you do more, and then suddenly you're invited to festivals, and it just kind of grows and grows and grows. So like I'm quite happy to live in a world where there's chaotic art. It doesn't matter like what it is, like just put it out there. Yeah, I'll get off my soapbox quickly.
So we are approaching the end of the conversation with our guest composer of today. Before we do, we have a few more questions I'd like to run by our guests. Well, here is one from somebody who is watching us. If you can address Sonia's question, do you enjoy collaborating across artistic disciplines?
Very much so. Very much so. I think like I used to do, it's been a while since I've done it, but I've done sort of like soundtracks to animated films. There's a season of Jungle Beat that I did, which I mean, it's it's a kid show, and it's fun, but I love sort of like, I was fortunate enough to be sort of taken around the studio to see what they were doing. And it is that sort of, it doesn't matter what the discipline is, you can always learn something from another person that you're working with. And also even on like a silly practical level, which is why I think something like the Nightlight Collective, in inverted commas, works, is that everybody within the group has their own thing that they bring to it, and as well as their own audience. So from a purely practical business kind of perspective, the more people that you work with, the bigger your audience gets, and the bigger their audience then gets. And it's sort of like it's, I don't know. I think this, whatever the art, it's great. Like, do it, theater, opera, whatever. Like I love it. Even like working a quartet with a band, that dance, that kind of stuff.
Okay, two quick questions before we go.
Yeah. Yes.
Which South African composers do you admire?
Who am I going to annoy today? No. I think I have to be 100% honest and say, from the very, very top of the list is obviously my dad. There is Peter Louis Van Dijk. I think a lot of the sound world and stuff that I use 100% comes from him. It's obviously like, it's a world that I grew up in. The use of thirds and stuff like that. I know there's a piece that I wrote at one point called "Songs My Father Taught Me," and it's 100% acknowledging that this is his sound world, and I will say this, and this is not under threat of being disowned or anything like that. That I think there are not many composers around who can write a climax like he can. And for the type of music that I like, the sort of like the big gesture kind of stuff, it really resonates with me. Other composers, obviously members of the Nightlight Collective, Galina Juritz, Cara Stacey. We work together. We like working together. So I think there is an element, or as far as I know, we like working together. But there is an element of we like each other's stuff. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing it. I think another composer outside of family and friends, I think of someone like Lisa Morrison. I think that the stuff that she does is fantastic. I think it's very, very creative. I should know. Meryl Fenoy. I really, really like the sort of electronic stuff that she does. Yeah, no, it's. I think one of the things that I've been very lucky with is that because I perform as well, I get to hear a lot of South African works. Naomi Younger, definitely love his stuff. Like it's yeah, I don't know if that answers, giving more answers than usual, but yeah.
It's fantastic. Thank you. And the last question is, which African composers, perhaps shall we say outside of South Africa, since you already collaborate quite a bit, but of course, within South Africa, outside South Africa, so Africa as a whole, which African composers have you identified as people that you will like to collaborate with at some point?
I have to be absolutely honest. My knowledge of composers outside of South Africa is not that big. Um, I unfortunately can't think of someone. I will probably the moment I hang up go, of course that one, you know. But it's just like I on that level I have focused much more on just within South Africa. I mean, as the podcast implies. So I know that that's very, very bad. Like I think of the name Thomas Souza, but I honestly I'm not even sure if he's still alive or not. Or yeah, on that level I'm not good.
No, that's fine. Brilliant. Food for thought for all of us, both of us, and everybody else watching. Absolutely, it's been interesting talking to you today. Interesting getting to know you, hear your history,
Thank
but how
you.
you did what you're working on, people you collaborate with, your podcast projects. It's been really interesting.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
who are watching us now. Thank you if you watch this later as a recorded interview. Thank you very much for the comments, the questions. We really appreciate them. Thank you to our guest composer as well for giving us your time and for joining us here today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Brilliant. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye
Thank you.
bye.
You too. Bye.